Hello, must readers. I'm Erin Popelka. I curate must read fiction, a place for people who know that life is better with a novel in hand. And I am so delighted to be here with Brian Platzer. Brian, thank you so much for being with us.
I'm so excited to have this conversation.
Great. Brian is the author of Bed-Stuy is Burning, his very first novel. He was born and raised in Manhattan, attended Columbia University for his bachelor's, and then got his MFA in fiction writing from Johns Hopkins University. Bed-Stuy is Burning is his first novel, but when he's not writing novels, he also teaches English for middle schoolers and is the co-founders of Teachers Who Tutor NYC. So we are going to have a great conversation, Brian. I'm so excited to talk about your book.
Thanks so much for doing this with me.
Yeah, so let's start there. Let's start with Bed-Stuy is Burning. Please tell me more about the book.
Sure thing. Well, Bed-Stuy, for those of you who don't know, is short for Bedford-Stuyvesant, which is the largest neighborhood geographically in central Brooklyn. And my wife and I moved into the neighborhood 8-9 years ago because we were living a couple subway stops closer to Manhattan and we're looking to buy because we knew that we were interested in having kids and wanted a little bit more space, and we couldn't afford anything essentially. So we went a couple subway stops farther away from Manhattan and looked around, and were amazed to discover that for the price of, one floor or a small one bedroom in a building in Clinton Hill, which was a gentrifying neighborhood before Bed-Stuy became one, really, we could afford an entire building in this sort of a beautiful tree-lined block in a, magnificent 1890s architecture with original detail and all that. And I came into all of this embarrassingly naive. I looked at the house and I said, like, this is a great thing. Like, I can't believe that if we take all our money in the world and borrow from everybody we know and rent out the top floor and the bottom floor, we can afford to do this. And people were lovely initially when we moved in, but I didn't quite understand what it meant that I was moving into this neighborhood. I started to notice, as you say, I'm an 8th grade English teacher. I started to notice a couple of years in that 3 out of 5 days on my way to work, I would see students not much older than the kids I'm teaching, like handcuffed and shackled and pressed up against that gate that separates the stairs to the street from the stairs down to the subway. It was under Police Commissioner Kelly at the time, that stop and frisk policy, where essentially what it meant is that if you look like somebody who has committed a crime recently, then police officers were allowed to stop you and go through your pockets, regardless of whether they had gotten a warrant ahead of time. And the sort of the statistics of that are still up in the air, because the trend lines were going in a direction where we were seeing less violent crime across most American cities at the time anyway. But some people argue that it worked. Some people argue that it didn't. But the lived experience of it was terrifying, because you had these kids who were publicly humiliated and mortified, most days. You had police who were stoically doing their job, but clearly weren't thrilled about having this be the manner in which they were interacting with the community. And then there were the commuters for whom this was theoretically done, both black and white, and we had no way to influence it in any way. It was just a very uncomfortable scene. And I started to imagine what would happen if tensions got ratcheted up a little bit. And, I was writing before the incidents and riots in Cleveland and St. Louis and Baltimore. But I had that sense that there was something in the air, that we were just, 1 or 2 instances of violence away from something really monumental happening. And so I imagined that happening in a sort of darker version of my neighborhood. And I wrote what I imagined people would be thinking and feeling along that experience, from the gentrifying family who moves into the neighborhood, to their friends and neighbors on the block, to, their black nanny who looks after their son, and, local kids who are caught up in the center of the riot, police officers. I just wanted to be able to try to imagine my way into this world where everybody was pressed and harried and terrified.
Yeah, like talk about the depth of content, and certainly like, yeah, you're getting to gentrification, you're getting to race, and certainly so with some of your characters, you're also getting into questions of faith and questions of God. And so where did you start? Like, did you have a specific question or an entry point as you started to write, or how did the journey of this novel begin for you?
That's a great question. I actually thought that the novel would be more autobiographical initially, and that it would be about a sort of naive-ish gentrifier stumbling into a neighborhood where he didn't really know what was going on, and that he would, learn more, and it would be a little bit farcical. But as I was writing, I just realized that was not the way I wanted to tell this story. That the gentrifier is an important character, but he's in many ways the least interesting one, or at least the least valuable perspective. And that if I was going to tell this story, I wanted to tell it from the perspective of everybody whose lives were changed by the changing neighborhood. Because to tell it differently, it seemed like telling, a fraction of the story. So I did as much research as I could, and I read into the histories of Bed-Stuy, the histories of gentrification in New York, of police brutality, of race riots, which, if you follow the history of race riots in America, it pretty much is a history of police brutality with very few exceptions. And I had hundreds of hours of conversations, both informally with my neighbors and interviews with high school kids at the local high school. I would sort of creepily loiter until people would be willing to chat with me, and police officers, and as many different people as I could, to try to get a sense that I had the ability and confidence to take a crack at it. And once I realized that I really wasn't going to be a character in this book, I imagined what kind of gentrifier would be the most compelling impetus for a lot of this action. And because Brooklyn has for so long been, known as the borough of churches, and Christian spiritual life is such an important aspect of the community. Still on Sundays, you see everybody in their Sunday best, and, people, God, or at least the community around God, is such a fascinating aspect and important aspect of the community. I thought a fascinating interloper would be somebody who had complicated issues with his own faith. Somebody who was Jewish and not Christian, moving into a neighborhood that was primarily Black and not white, somebody who had once believed but lost faith in that belief. And then the idea that he found gambling as a kind of substitute for religion, I was excited by, because so much of gentrification feels, if not synonymous, at least aligned with gambling in some way. You have people who are making a financial bet that they're not going to lose all of their financial resources in a neighborhood, and in a less crass way, a familial bet that this will be a place that will offer the newcomer to the neighborhood far more than they need to give back to it. And I find that that's part of the really complicated morality that is true in the book, but is also true in my life, where I get so much more from this neighborhood than I give. And I'm still trying to figure out a way to create that balance. I mean, my kids are friends with other kids on the block. It's a real neighborhood in a way that I definitely didn't grow up with, growing up in an apartment building in downtown Manhattan. But like, we know all our neighbors, and our neighbors know all of us, and my kids shout their names as they walk down the block, and we have play dates and barbecues and meals and birthday parties. And it's so incredible to be a part of the community. But in spite of all of that, or what complicates all of that, or where there are moral repercussions of all of that, is my being a part of the community makes the community different from a lot of the reasons why my neighbors have loved living in that community for so long. The fact that it isn't as Black means that it doesn't have some of the same cultural, I don't even know what the word would be. It doesn't retain a lot of the cultural reasons why people are so proud to live here initially. And of course, it's still vibrant and wonderful and spectacular in all its ways. But it's changing. And my arrival in the neighborhood, just like my protagonist's arrival in the neighborhood, means that people who have lived here their entire lives, who have rented and grown up, with their family and friends surrounding them, can't afford to live here anymore, because essentially racism has moved from our neighborhood to the next neighborhood, and white people now aren't scared of Bed-Stuy anymore to the same degree. So it's a complicated moral transition that I'm still working out my own culpability in a little bit. But that's why it felt so important to tell this story from that community, perspective and moral perspective, while trying to tell as, fun and exciting a story as I could.
Absolutely. And certainly I imagine that, like, living in the neighborhood that you were also writing about, and while it was a fictional account of Bed-Stuy, I imagine there was probably some really interesting dissonance that happened as you were kind of imagining this one scenario and then living out another.
Absolutely. And the one piece of criticism that I've received consistently from my neighbors on my block, who their first reaction was like pride, I think, just like any friend would be. They're like, this is so great. You got this novel at finish line, it's going to get readership. Once they read the book, what I heard from a couple of people was like, this couldn't happen here. Like we would be looking out for you. Like we wouldn't allow an uprising and a riot to focus on you just because you're the only white family on the block. Like we cared more about that than, and I realized that it's not obvious to everybody the degree to which that, like, I exaggerated things and made things more sinister and changed aspects of my life. And it has nothing to do with my experience personally, because that to me was a more compelling story and a more useful story to tell than the truth, which is that it's been so wonderful and everybody's been so gracious, and I've been so lucky, and people around me have been so lovely, in spite of the fact that I am enabling a neighborhood change, and following me comes more police officers, and maybe lights on lampposts get fixed a little bit more quickly because of the political and economic influence that people like me unfortunately have. But along with that are a lot of changes that really have ruined people's lives, and trying to be aware of that as I was writing the book, and trying to be as honest about my own perspective as well as about the perspectives of people who share characteristics of my neighbors was definitely something that I tried to be as aware of as I was capable of.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I'm glad you got such like a warm reaction from your neighbors. Certainly, novels do better when bad things happen. So I'm glad that that's not the case in your day-to-day life.
Absolutely. Exactly. No, I mean, in real life, I just feel so lucky to be a part of this community, which isn't the case with everybody I know who have moved into new neighborhoods, whether, Bed-Stuy or other areas in Brooklyn, where neighbors, I think, retain a reasonable degree of skepticism, of, wondering sort of why, after we've been, legally punished with issues of redlining, meaning that people could only rent within certain neighborhoods if they were Black, or get loans in certain neighborhoods, to, culturally just being known for crime and hip hop, and now that the neighborhood gets a little bit nicer, sort of now you're discovering it, that sort of vocabulary of discovery can be so off-putting and so patronizing that I know people who have moved into other primarily Black or Hispanic or Asian neighborhoods, and their neighbors sort of say, like, what are you doing, man? Like, this is our thing. Like, we had to make the best of a bad situation, and now once it's sort of established and wonderful, now you're moving back in. And
Right.
I've been lucky to have avoided I talk about those issues with my neighbors, but I've avoided being confronted with a lot of those issues more aggressively. But these are real problems and real issues that I part of the reason I wrote the book is because I think a lot of people who don't live in these neighborhoods are unaware of how conscious residents of these neighborhoods are, and how much of their lives are really fundamentally influenced by the changes.
Yeah. And so you have lived in New York City for quite a long time, born and raised. You went to Columbia, you're in Brooklyn
Yeah.
now. So I would just love to hear, kind of how New York City has impacted you, in the past, how it continues to impact you. And if you have any memorable stories, that really sum up the city for you.
Well, the city, especially the neighborhood where I grew up, has changed so much since I was growing up there in the early 80s in downtown Manhattan, where, literally graffiti covered every surface, where there were multiple homeless people selling sort of found items on every block, where people were scared to use the subway, wouldn't walk through Washington Square Park, which is a couple blocks from where I grew up, at night, sometimes even during the day. There you'd see hypodermic needles and drug vials everywhere. And it has been scraped of all of that, for the better and worse. I think for the better, because it's a safer, lovelier, you go to Washington Square Park now and you're blinded by the different colors of flowers and performers and college kids traipsing and around holding hands. But for the less wonderful, because I think part of what made Manhattan, and I guess when I say Manhattan, I mean Manhattan below 125th Street for the most part, special to a lot of people throughout the years, was the fact that it could be a world where people who worked on Wall Street lived alongside lawyers, alongside actors and writers and teachers and police officers and civil servants of all kinds. And it's really hard to afford that now. It's really hard to afford to live in Manhattan unless you make a lot of money. And of course, there are exceptions, and there are some rent control places. But me growing up, it was all I knew, so when people are interested in what it means to grow up on Broadway and 4th Street and, walk to school and not own a car and sort of see all types of people every morning, that to me was less interesting than, being driven to school and living with a front yard where you could play sports and having, parents drive to go to work. Like it's just what I was used to. But growing up was where I was, even in Greenwich Village in the 80s, and especially in the 90s and into the aughts. It was, if not monocultural, it wasn't as diverse as it sometimes gets credit for being. Alphabet City to the east might have been, and certainly Harlem and Spanish Harlem and some other neighborhoods in Manhattan. But in my neighborhood, my parents were, upwardly mobile professionals, are still, and that tended to be the world where I spent most of my time. And that wasn't the case for my wife, who is, I guess, a second generation gentrifier, for all the goods and bads that brings. But it meant a lot to her and to me as well, that our kids learn more about more cultures than I did. I sort of felt like I was around a lot of different people growing up, probably more than I actually was, because I was in a kind of naive proximity to a lot of people, riding the subway to high school every morning. But in terms of actual relationships, I probably pretended to have a more varied social world than I actually did. And it's important to my wife and me that not be the case for our kids. So even though, like, I grew up in downtown Manhattan, I went to high school in uptown Manhattan, I went to college in even upper town Manhattan, I was in a relatively cloistered world, partially by the schools that my parents could afford to send me to, and partially probably because of my own latent discomfort with people who I was, not as accustomed to being around. So I think the book is also a working through of some of those feelings in as uncritical but honest a way as possible.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Absolutely. And yeah, and I imagine, yes, New York has changed a ton over your lifetime for sure. And you've probably seen it definitely up close and personal.
Absolutely,
And
absolutely. I mean, if you choose any neighborhood and delve into how there's no porn in Times Square anymore, and there are no, there are so few police officers who live in Manhattan, and they're just every neighborhood has its own very change. Soho, when I grew up, was just for artists. It was zoned that you needed to be an artist to live in some of these apartments, and now they're the $3 to $30 million places that hedge funders and celebrities live. So it is a fascinating, just historical journey that Manhattan has taken, and now that various neighborhoods are taking, from those closest to Manhattan, whether you want to call that Brooklyn Heights initially, and then, not, I guess 20 years ago now, we're talking Williamsburg, and then Greenpoint and Fort Greene and Clinton Hill, and now Bed-Stuy, and now it's East New York. But it really has been subway station to subway station where we're seeing these dramatic changes.
sure. Oh my goodness. Yeah. And so I'm going to pivot just a little bit. So you
Anything.
teach English and also co-founded Teachers Who Tutor NYC. So I would just love to hear a little bit more about your commitment to education and your commitment to the next generation.
Sure thing. And as with everything in my book, I don't want to pretend that my commitment was more charitable than it actually was. So I needed a way essentially to make a couple dollars and get health care after my MFA at Johns Hopkins, because I was writing, and I didn't want to get sick and die. So I was looking around for jobs that I was qualified for, and because I had done some teaching at Johns Hopkins, I found a job teaching middle school, and it was so great. Like I thought that it was mercenary initially, but I just so loved teaching 7th and 8th graders, where it's this funny age where they still really don't know anything, but they have the intellectual capacity to be excited by things. So like everything I say is new and exciting, and they want to hear more, and they want to talk more about whatever. I teach a class that tries to deal with literature that they wouldn't confront, but that is as representative of different ideas and thoughts and cultures as possible. So teaching them, one day about the Holocaust, and the next day about, the China in the 70s and re-education, and then I get to do some Paul Auster, just because why not add some metafiction to it, and do some Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go, because they live in this sort of dystopian universe that they're reading so much teenage dystopian books that I like to try to transition. But just like telling them things as an and going through literary analysis as an excuse for us to think more deeply and to write, just seemed like such a wonderful way to earn money and to spend some time as I was trying to publish a novel, and get these sort of slowly get pieces in the New Yorker or the New York Times, or build a resume. Hanging out with 8th graders was just like way more fun than I anticipated it being. And then the tutoring company came because kids in my class, there was one year especially where the difference between their take-home work and their in-class work was noticeable. And I did some asking around, and there were a lot of students being tutored, but being tutored in a way that was maybe more focused on short-term game, would be a kinder euphemism to discuss it with, where you were having kids who were, real smart, many Ivy League or otherwise kids right out of undergrad who were pursuing degrees in the arts, but who didn't have any of the pedagogical background to help students. So I was looking for an organization where I could recommend my students be tutored or get extra help from professionals, and I couldn't find one. So my co-partner on this, Abby, who's a longtime 4th grader, and I decided to gather together a lot of teachers whom we trusted and liked, and were vouched for, and ideally it's a win-win-win, where the students get the kind of support that comes from people with master's degrees in education who have taught these subjects tutoring from kindergarten through 12th grade, and teachers who are obviously underpaid get to earn money doing work that they care about, and Abby and I get to take a couple bucks on top to pay the mortgage. So it's something I'm very lucky in that the jobs that I found a way to make money and pay bills and keep food for my kids, doing things that are something that I believe are sort of acceptably moral use of my time as well, while I was trying to write and write and write.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it does seem like there's, a theme of questions, like really great questions in the book, really great questions that you ask your eighth graders, and then questions that you see in your life and you're like, hey, we can fix this, so fantastic.
Absolutely. And if not fix it, at least that we can try to understand a little bit more about what's going on and more about what's driving our own motivations and the motivations of our students and colleagues and friends and neighbors and kids, wives, parents.
Right. Which is actually almost like a beautiful summing up of fiction, right? It's this
Absolutely.
chance that we get to like explore a new world and be in different
exercise
skins.
in empathy,
Yeah.
which is why I totally understand people on the side of the cultural appropriation argument saying, like, really, a white guy is going to come in and write about a neighborhood that white people have been oppressing and taking commercial advantage of for years? Like, really, he's going to sell a novel about that? Like, that is morally inexcusable and sort of empathetically impossible. I totally respect that opinion, and I so wholeheartedly disagree with it. Like, I think that the job of art is to try to tell a compelling story, but to try to understand and to try to imagine one ways into the other's perspective, and to say, like, there's this other that I can't even fathom, that are so different from me that it's sort of, we don't even exist in the same world or human experience. That's horrifying to me, and I think that exacerbates a lot of the political problems that we have in our moment. So yeah, that was a little lecture on something you didn't ask about.
No, but it's that question, right? Yeah.
That it's literature's job and art's job and fiction's job to try to have that conversation, even if it doesn't succeed entirely.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think that is a great place to close. So thank you for wading into those questions. Thank you for, kind of doing that beautiful exercise in empathy. And thank you for inviting us all on the journey. So must readers, please do check out Bed-Stuy is Burning by Brian Platzer. Brian, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you so much. This was such a great conversation.